All right, good evening. We are going to get started. I want to introduce myself. So I'm Susie Plott. I'm the Community Development and Marketing Manager for Old Mission Santa Barbara. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. We are really excited to be launching this speaker series, bringing you all together to start an important conversation around race. We are also excited to have over 100 people attending tonight. We are recording the session and it will be posted on our website for the community, as we think it's important for everyone to be a part of this conversation. A few housekeeping items. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. If you have any questions for either Old Mission Santa Barbara staff, so myself, or our speaker this evening, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will have time at the end for questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to enter them there, as I'll be keeping an eye on those, either responding directly or keeping them for the Q&A at the end to ask our speaker. Our speakers have also, throughout the entire series, have wonderfully agreed to create a resource document with links to articles, videos, and books for you to explore on the topic afterwards, if you wish. An email will be sent out following this session with that information. This speaker series is also being offered free, as we feel like it's an important conversation for us to be a part of. However, we want you to know that we are paying the speakers, as we value the work and the time that they are putting into their presentations and providing us with. So if you would like to support the mission and this speaker series, we will also include a donation link in the email that goes out. However, that is completely optional and not required at all. We just want to provide that as an option for those of you who would like to support. And we appreciate all of your support in being here this evening. I would now like to introduce Brother Mark, our guardian here at Old Mission Santa Barbara, to kick us off this evening.
Hey, hello, good evening. I'm just so excited that you took the time to be with us. Susie has done a lot of coordination. I want to thank her. Thank you, Bob, for giving us a presentation. We are excited and ready for it. So I'm the guardian here at Old Mission Santa Barbara. That's in 2 weeks, it means 1 year. So I'm getting to know the friars here and the staff here, and what the mission represents, not only the community, but to greater California. In looking at what's going on in the country and in the world, the mission staff felt it'd be important to address issues that are in the news, but more importantly, that are real. And one of those is racism and other injustices related to that. So that's what the genesis of our series is from. I have been a friar for 43 years, and I've been allowed to promote nonviolence issues for most of my life as a friar. And I discovered that I learned about nonviolence from, of course, St. Francis of Assisi, who learned it from the teachings of Jesus, but also in my lifetime through Martin Luther King Jr., his wife, Coretta Scott King, from Dorothy Day, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, even the late John Lewis. If we're going to promote nonviolence, we have to get down and kind of dirty and see what's really going on in the world. And we can't do it from what I call ignorance. A lot of people make judgments on it from ignorance. What we want to present to you is the truth. So I want you to know that I trust the 5 speakers that we have picked, and you will learn the truth. And from that, then you can have some educated and Christian and wholehearted ways of dealing with the issues that pop up. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So if you have the truth, Jesus says in the Gospel of John, the truth's going to set you free. I'm excited here at the mission because if we're set free, where's that going to lead us? So after this series, we get to ask that question. Where's this leading us to? All right. So I'd like to introduce Bob Senkewicz, Robert Senkewicz. He's the from Santa Clara University. He's related to the history department there. We know him because he was 14 years here at the mission with our archives library, tongue twister, archives library. And he was the board president for about 7 of those years. So he's familiar with the mission. So Bob and Rosemarie Bibia are authors. And the one book that they wrote, which I actually read, it's really thick. I actually read 3 summers ago in 2 weeks. I read 2 chapters a day. It's called Junipero Serra, California Indians and the Transformation of a Missionary. And the great thing for me was it has the writings of Serra all throughout it, and I finally learned what this man was about. Anyway, enough of me. I just wanted to say hello and thank you for being with us. And now I turn it over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Brother Mark. It's wonderful for me to be here with all of you. And I was looking through the list of participants as you were coming in, and I know a number of you, so it's wonderful that we have an opportunity to meet again, even virtually. The background behind me is Santa Clara University. Some of you have been there. It's a campus that has one of the original California missions, at least the site, on campus. My talk this afternoon, is basically an introduction to the other speakers. They're going to go into much more detail. I'm going to give a broad view of the role of race and ethnicity in California history. And if any of the subsequent speakers are here, I think a couple of them are, please don't cringe too much at my superficiality. I'm going to be broad, not deep, and leave the depth for our subsequent speakers. So we'll begin. If I know how to do this, we can get everything together here. And let's see, so we get this. There we go there. And then the slideshow from the beginning. Whoops. Okay, so this is where we are exploring the history of race in California. And this is our introduction. Well, when you ask who lives in California, nowadays, you know, we know of California, and we all accept the fact that California is a multicultural state, and that's one of its great strengths. But that was not always the case. A movie that came out 30 years ago kind of looked at the question of who lives in California, and they gave a kind of it's a wonderful movie, but they gave a different answer.
La mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs a des reflets d'argent. La mer, des reflets changeants sous la pluie. La mer au ciel d'été confond ces blancs moutons avec les anges si purs. La mer, bergère d'azur infinie de la mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs à des reflets d'argent. La mer, des reflets changeants sous la pluie. La mer au ciel d'été confond ses blancs moutons.
Well, that's certainly one version of who lives in California. And, you know, I enjoyed that movie very much when I saw it. It came out in 1991. And, you know, LA Story might more accurately have been titled Part of LA Story, because in the census of 1990, 1 year before this movie came out, the actual population distribution of Los Angeles was, it was 41% Caucasian, 37% Hispanic, as they called it back then, 11% that African American, 10% or so Asian, and 2 or 3% indigenous. Even back then, Los Angeles and California was a very, very multicultural place, and it was that way from the beginning. California was the most densely populated part of North America. You know, the North America that's in the United States, that's the U.S. Before the arrival of the Europeans. Best guesses are somewhere around 310 to 325,000 people live here. And anthropologists normally divide people up according to ethnic, tribal, and linguistic groups. And this map from the Indian Library gives you a sense of the diversity that was very much a part of indigenous California. But of course, the Europeans did come, and they came in the 15 and 16 and 1700s. I show this picture a lot when Rosemary and I are talking about Sarah. This was a picture that was taken in 2015, a couple of months before Sarah's canonization, at a mass in Rome that was held at the North American College, the American Seminary over there. And Archbishop Gomez on the right has just given the Pope a relic of Father Sarah, and the Pope is venerating this. And when I show this picture, I say, you know, the important thing about this picture is those two bishops. And the bishops are basically, the important thing is that both of them were born in Latin America. And that's really super important. Archbishop Gomez was born in Monterrey, Mexico, and the Pope, of course, was born in Argentina. Before 1846, California was not part of North America like we think of North America. California was part of Latin America. And to understand California before 1846, you really need to understand what the Latin American colonial experience was. And they had this thing called syncretism. You know, the kind of Catholicism that took root in Latin America is really nicely symbolized by this picture that Bob Jackson took a number of years ago of a church in Hidalgo, Mexico. And you see on the wall of this church, you see a jaguar warrior right there, you know, and that jaguar warrior is, of course, an Aztec symbol, and yet it's on the walls of a Catholic church. And that shows the kind of syncretism and the kind of mixing that was an inevitable part of Catholicism as it developed in pre-US California. This famous picture of Mission San Gabriel gives you a sense of that, because what you can see is in the foreground here, and I'm sorry that this, please say that again, is coming up, and I need to just drop for a second because I didn't turn off one of my other programs, so hold on for 1 second here. Yeah, so that will be now coming back. I'm sorry about that. Whoops. So there's Mission San Gabriel, and the foreground there is this indigenous dwelling right here. It was painted by Ferdinand Deppe. Interestingly enough, for those of you who were from Santa Barbara, Deppe painted this on a journey that he was taking towards San Diego. He didn't paint it, he made the original sketches. And excuse me, the person who was with him on that journey was Alfred Robinson, who married, of course, as you know, Anita de la Guerra, for one of the leading families of Santa Barbara. The important thing to remember is the kind of syncretism that takes place in pre-US California Catholicism is a syncretism where the indigenous voice and the indigenous spirituality was very, very significant here. In Mission San Fernando, an indigenous artist painted a series of Stations of the Cross, which show that very, very clearly. This is the 6th station where Veronica is wiping the face of Jesus, Veronica, a woman. And if you look at Veronica and look at some of these other women who are with Jesus, who are sympathizing with him and weeping for him, you notice that they're all in red skirts. If you think back of that Depe painting, the red skirts were worn by indigenous people. And so what this Indian artist is saying is that the people who were comforting Jesus during his passion were actually Indians, were the indigenous people. And that's our role. We are suffering here like Jesus was suffering. And again, the 7th station, the very next station, Jesus is falling. He falls 3 times on his way to the cross. And you can see that the soldiers there are not treating him very nicely. But the really interesting thing is this guy here. Most drawings of the Stations of the Cross didn't have horses in them. Well, who in California in 1800 had horses? Well, guys who were like this, the Spanish soldiers. So what's happening here is that the people who are comforting Jesus are the indigenous people who are suffering with him, and the people who are oppressing Jesus are the Spanish soldiers. It's a real important statement that the indigenous people are making, and it's a great example of the way in which religion in pre-US California was a creative mix of indigenous spirituality and imported Spanish Catholicism. The great symbol of that is this picture of the Archangel Raphael, which is at Mission Santa Ynez. Some of you have been to Mission Santa Ynez and have seen it. The Archangel is clearly a Chumash Indian. And again, this is the kind of thing that is super, super important. So in Spanish America, in Latin America, the religion is a religion in which indigenous people give their own imprint upon that religion. And that's important because, you know, we tend to think of marginal groups or of oppressed groups as having all of their initiative and creativity taken away from them. And that is certainly not the case. And the indigenous people in California are a great example of this. This is a picture of an indigenous group dancing outside of Mission Dolores. It was painted in about 1817. Those of you who've been to San Francisco, that building is still there. It's 16th and Dolores. And these Indians have just agreed to enter the mission system, and what they are doing is a ceremonial dance. And clearly the purpose of the ceremonial dance is to purify the land before they enter into the mission system. So the mission system from their point of view is going to be a mix of what the Padres think it is, and more importantly, what they think it is. So the indigenous voice is kind of very important, and it's also a very, very important way of getting a sense of the issues relating to race and ethnicity in California. We're never going to get the situation where groups are so totally oppressed that their whole voice is completely gone. And in fact, you know, one of the things that it's important to remember is that indigenous people are still around. This is James Ramos, who's a member of the California Assembly right now. He was elected in 2018, and he is an indigenous person. He was a member, in fact, the president of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians in San Bernardino County. So the indigenous people, with the kind of indigenous spirituality, indigenous folkways, and indigenous way of life, are still very much a part of what we have in California. But the indigenous people were important for another way as well, because California, as part of Latin America, did not have the same kind of immigration that a lot of British North America did as they pushed westward. This is the great picture of westward expansion, and it's a family coming in, and families were basically, they had individual family farms, you know. But, well, of course, that was not the case, as you well know, in California, because we had missions, and the missions were labored by the indigenous people. So California becomes a place in which agriculture has a special quality, or characteristic that goes from the Mission Day through the Rancho Day into U.S. California. And that is that the farms are big. They're kind of little California versions of Mexican haciendas. And the labor force on those farms is of a different ethnic group than the people who own and manage the land. And that makes California a very different kind of way. You know, this is and what happens after the missions, you get the Rancho period. This is Rancho Refugio right down there, Dos Pueblos. And in all of these ranchos, there's, you know, Rancho San Pascual and in the LA area. In all of these ranchos, as you can see from this rancho scene, which was done by an American military officer in 1848, had Indian laborers. This rancho was actually probably the rancho of Manuel Jimeno and Angustias de la Guerra, who was one of the daughters, along with Anita de la Guerra, of Jose de la Guerra y Noriega, outside of Monterey. And this drawn by William Rich Hutton, another American a military officer, you can clearly see that the people who are doing the work are the indigenous people. And that basically goes from that day till this day in California. In California, the people who work the fields are of a different ethnic group than the people who own and manage the fields. And you, especially in the citrus industry in Southern California, look at the laborers in Riverside. You know, they are Asians. And look at the laborers at Santa Ana. Some of them are South Asians. You know, that kind of thing is a persistent, that kind of racial component is a persistent aspect of California agriculture from that day to this day. All you have to do is drive 101 through the Salinas Valley to know, as you all do, that this is the same nowadays. Well, the next big ethnic group that comes into California after the Spaniards and then the rancho owners are the Chinese. The Chinese they come first in the gold rush, and they are a source of fascination to the people who come to California from the East Coast. They're fascinating in two ways. They're the first large group of Asians that come into the United States, and maybe even more importantly, they are the first large group of non-Christians who come into California, and they are active members, active participants in the gold rush, as you can see from this 1852 picture of Auburn Ravine. The Chinese generally came in groups, which made them kind of suspicious to the American miners, who generally came as individuals, at least at the beginning. They didn't speak English, and they didn't go to church on Sunday, and all of those things served to make them kind of different. But they were a very, very important part of the gold rush. And of course, after the gold rush, they were the laborers who basically built the western part of the Transcontinental Railroad from Sacramento to the Golden Spike. They're not really, you know, who celebrated in the railroad. Well, it's the Big Four. It's also Theodore Judah, a guy who's not as well known, but who discovered that the Dutch flat route up here was what made it possible for the Transcontinental Railroad to be built on a grade that wasn't going to be too steep. Well, you all know, I mean, the work, you know, the railroad company did not keep super great records on the Chinese, but we know that there were a lot of them. We have no idea how many of them died. You know, what these guys are doing is making cuts, and they're going up here, and they're cutting down the road so that the railroad can get through cuts like these, and all of this granite and stone and everything like that were cut by hand by these Chinese laborers who were sitting in little swings on the side of the on the side of things like this, and they were the ones who actually built the railroads, the Chinese. There's the famous picture of the Golden Spike. Well, as it turns out, about half an hour before that picture was taken, the Chinese were sent off to lunch And so no, there are no Chinese in that picture. And so the picture itself, that very famous picture, and these are the two chief engineers of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. This picture gives an incredibly inaccurate view of who actually built the railroads. And indeed, on the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike last year, a whole bunch of descendants of the people who actually worked on the railroad, these are the descendants of the Chinese workers. They came to Promontory Point and they recreated the picture, and giving a more accurate picture of what the labor force actually was. Well, after the Chinese finished the railroad, they migrated generally to San Francisco, and their migration to San Francisco happened to correspond with the beginning of a huge depression in the American economy. It's called the Panic of 1873, but it basically persisted all throughout the 1870s. And in San Francisco, the notion that the Chinese were taking away jobs from Americans becomes very, very prevalent. There are a whole series of Chinese rallies that take place in the city. Dennis Carney, the labor leader who organized a lot of them, ended all of his speeches with one phrase: "The Chinese must go." And Carney organized a working man's party, and there it is: the Chinese must go. Where should they go? Back to China, where they belong. And there was violence against the Chinese. And there you can see some of these. The first blow at the Chinese question, the working man's party. Immigration trying to be restricted. And of course, in the East Coast, some of the papers had a field day with this. Pacific Chivalry, a California Carneyite abuses a Chinese immigrant. But it was pretty intense. And it wasn't only in San Francisco. There were anti-Chinese riots and vigilante action. This is one in Los Angeles in 1871. Chinese were killed there. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, in 1885, a group of miners got together to chase out Chinese miners. And the next year in Seattle, the Knights of Labor, a labor organization, got together to take vengeance on the Chinese that they felt were stealing their jobs. Well, of course, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. You know, there are a lot of acts that you kind of, like the Patriot Act and things like that, you can't tell from the title what it was all about. Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act was not one of those acts. You can tell from the title what it was intended to do, which was to exclude Chinese, and it did very, very well. It was renewed in 1892 and made permanent in 1902. And it remained on the books until 1943, when President Roosevelt got it repealed because we were fighting World War II, and the Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek were allies of the U.S. But the Chinese who remained were stereotyped, and you can see from this map of San Francisco in 1885, what did the Chinese do? They gambled, they did prostitution, they did opium, and they didn't go to church. They had their own little temples here. So Chinatown was a place of vice and corruption because the Chinese were a people. So the popular notion went of vice and corruption. Well, what happens is that at the same time that this is happening, there's always a kind of a continuing immigration to California from Mexico. If you've ever gone across the Carquinez Bridge in the Bay Area, heading up to Lake Tahoe, you pass this sign, Benicia and Vallejo, which are two towns, but they are named after two of the most elite members of the Mexican landed aristocracy in pre-U.S. California. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, who was the potentate of Sonoma, and his wife, Francisca Benicia Vallejo. And what happens is that as the California elite loses their land, like the Ortegas and the De La Guerras here in the Santa Barbara area, what happens is that there continues to be a migration from Mexico, often enough of not people on the elite. And often enough, the relationship between the elite and the non-elite was within the Mexican community was not always super happy. That's a great picture. There's Francisca Benicia Vallejo with her daughter, her granddaughter, and her great-granddaughter. And this is a typical studio picture in the 19th century, and the Vallejo family had it taken so that they could try to convince the American elite that they were part of them, but it really didn't work out that way. The ranchos kind of were taken over. This lady, Eulalia Perez from San Gabriel, was a very interesting lady. She was a non-elite lady, even though her husband owned for a while Rancho San Pascual, which is where Pasadena and Altadena are now. But there was a little bit of a tension between the elite and the non-elite. But as the turn of the century happens and you get the Spanish revival movement, you're getting at the same time that this, calling it the Spanish revival movement was no accident, even though most quote, Spaniards, unquote, in pre-US California were actually of mestizo heritage. But you get this kind of, the mythology of the El Camino Real as a continuous road, from San Diego to Sonoma, and you get the celebration of all things Spanish. But you do get, especially after 1910, with the instability in Mexico as a result of the Mexican Revolution, you get an increase of Mexicans who come into the United States, and largely into California or Texas. During the 1920s, you get a spike of immigration as a result of the Cristero movement, where the New Mexican government, it becomes very anti-clerical, and a number of Catholic people leave. Then you get kind of during the Depression, it eases off, we'll take a look at that. And then after World War II with the Bracero program, especially in the mid-50s, it really spikes again as the Bracero program becomes kind of a way for growers to get cheap non-unionized labor. This guy is interesting. If you've ever seen the Wizard of Oz, this is the castle of the Wicked Witch of the West. Well, actually, that was created by a Mexican, by this guy, Candelario Rivas, who was he was a Cristero refugee in the 1920s, who found work in Hollywood and became a very successful graphic artist. But he was kind of the exception because most people work in the fields. And during the Depression, the same thing happens to the Mexicans that happened to the Chinese after they finished building the railroad, and they were victims of a depression. If there is a depression, bad economic times in California, who gets blamed? The immigrants get blamed. And in the early years of the Great Depression, roughly 500,000 Mexicans are deported from the United States. And there's some the station in LA. Of those 500,000, about 100 to 150,000 were from California, and the overwhelming majority of the others were from Texas. That's why there were jobs for the people from Oklahoma in the fields, because all the Mexicans who had been working in the fields had been deported. And the notion was that Americans would take over those jobs, and of course it didn't happen. Native Californians would take over those jobs, and of course it did not happen. But in the early days of World War II, as they begin to come back, as people are drafted and growers need, you get kind of the Mexican population begins to grow, and the fashion of the day is the zoot suit. And there they are. And in 1943, a group of sailors rampaged through downtown Los Angeles and killed about 20 or so Mexicans in what's called the Zoot Suit riots. The Zoot Suit riots are kind of like the racial riots that happened in America after World War I. They're called riots, but they were really vigilante mobs who basically looked for minority people and beat them up, and in many cases killed them. And the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles were very, very much of that part of American history. And there you have a kind of somebody trying to help one of the rioters who had been hurt by by the local police, and there are people waiting to be deported. But something else also happens with the Mexicans. I don't know if you know who this lady is, and I wouldn't have known a couple of years ago. Her name is Sylvia Mendez, and there she is being given the Medal of Freedom by President Obama a number of years ago. Sylvia Mendez is very important because in 1946, her father, supported by the ACLU, and sued the Westminster School District in Southern California for segregating Mexican children in schools, and he won. She won the suit. The suit wasn't based on federal law; it was based on state laws. And it's an important, not as well known, but the Mendez versus Westminster suit is a very, very important civil rights case. And indeed, the governor of California in 1846 was named Earl Warren, who, of course, in 1854 is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who hands down the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And there are some constitutional scholars who think that Warren was very affected by the Mendez suit that happened in California under his governorship. The more recent aspects of the Mexicans, of course, are related to the farm worker movement. But what's not as well known is that in its original days, the farm workers, in fact, the farm workers who started the grape strike were a group of Filipino farm workers led by this man, Larry Itliong. And you can see it, he was holding a sign identifying himself as the head of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, which was a largely Filipino union that had been formed under the auspices of the AFL-CIO. Cesar Chavez's group, and Walter Reuther was holding the sign, the National Farm Workers Association, was largely a Mexican group. And what they did, the new union was called the United Farm Workers because it was a unity between these two formerly distinct groups, the Filipino AWOC and the Mexican National Farm Workers Administration. So it was a very, very, the farm worker movement itself, it was much more multicultural and ethnically diverse than we might think of it. After the Chinese had been excluded and Chinese immigration to California really declines, the Japanese immigration really starts tremendously. And the Japanese are often greeted in the same way that the Chinese had been. And in fact, in 1906, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed an ordinance segregating Japanese children in the San Francisco public schools. And this was a huge issue. Teddy Roosevelt had to form a gentleman's agreement with, it's caused a huge issue with U.S. and Japanese relationships. And this from Harper's Weekly, an official from D.C. is begging San Francisco not to embarrass the administration. But in San Francisco, the anti-Chinese stuff is basically very easily transferred to the Japanese. And in fact, Mayor Eugene Schmitz, who was mayor during the earthquake and a member, in fact, of a political party called the Union Labor Party. As the headline says, he wants the Exclusion Act to be applied to the Japanese as well. And of course, it eventually wasn't. But when World War II, of course, broke out, this kind of sentiment, this is a 1920, James Phelan had been a mayor of San Francisco and then was a U.S. senator. Look what he's running on in 1920. Keep California white. And he basically was against two groups. He was against the Mexicans and he was against the Japanese. But of course, World War II, this is actually during the 30s. Restrictive deed covenants were very, very prominent. Keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Kind of ironic that the person saying it's a white man's neighborhood is a white woman, but that's another story. And of course, during the war, the Japanese very clearly, even though by this time the majority of Japanese living in California were native born, but their loyalty was tested. They were waiting for a signal from home to put all of this TNT. And you know, it's the stereotypical way in which they're drawn. When I show this to my students when I teach, I say, anything else you recognize you might find strange about this? Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss was the cartoonist. He regretted this so much after the war. But the fact that he did this shows how prevalent the anti-Japanese sentiment was during the war. And of course, that led to relocation, the exclusion of civilians, the ouster of Japanese from California, and the setting up of all of these relocation centers, mainly on the West Coast, but some of them go all the way over into Arkansas as well. Interestingly enough, one Japanese photographer, Toyo Miyatake, actually, he was a photographer who was locked up. He was able to smuggle in to Monsignor. This is at Monsignor. He was able to smuggle in the makings of a camera, and he cobbled together a camera and took some of the most powerful pictures of the internment process, including these three kids at the fence. Fred Korematsu, who was the one who sued against the exclusion, and he lost the case. His family was a very prosperous family in Oakland, and they lost their flower shop. Of course, the army was segregated, but after loyalty of some people was proven, they were allowed to join the army and the 442nd Regiment, which trained in segregated Hattiesburg, Mississippi, of all places, became, as you know, one of the most decorated regiments in the war. And finally, I want to talk a little bit in conclusion about African Americans. And don't think the fact that I left them for last means that they weren't present. They were present in California from the beginning. In fact, this lady, Bridget Mason, whose nickname was Biddy, was actually a slave who was brought to California by her owner. They went first to Utah. I think he was a Mormon. Then they went to San Bernardino, which was a Mormon settlement in California. And there she got some people to support her, and she sued for her freedom. Because the California Constitution, this is in 1857, 1858, the California Constitution was an anti-slavery constitution. Slavery was not allowed. And the reason was not because, the people who did the California Constitution in Monterey in 1849 loved African Americans. No, they just didn't. There was one guy who came from, I think, Mississippi and brought 20 slaves with him, and each of the slaves then kind of put out a claim, in the early days of the gold rush, and they were all his claims. So the miners didn't want people bringing more slaves in, when they were trying to do their individual claims, and they didn't want slave owners bringing in slaves to do their own claims. And so what happened was that they outlawed slavery. And Biddy Mason sued, and she got her freedom. She becomes a very, very wealthy hotel owner, a boarding house keeper, and then a very rich, fairly rich woman in Los Angeles. And she becomes, at the end of her life, a philanthropist, supporting other African Americans who were living in the Southern California area. So African Americans are always very, very prevalent, not in great numbers, but importantly. Indeed, in San Francisco during the Civil War, a lady named Charlotte Brown was evicted from the omnibus streetcar company, and they weren't cable cars; they were horse-drawn streetcars. She was thrown off, and she sued, and she won her suit. And she went back on, and she was thrown off again. And she sued again, and she won, and she got, the initial jury gave her damages of 5 cents, which was the fare of for the omnibus. But then she got more damages, and she kind of made an important kind of point. So African Americans are always present, not in large numbers as other groups, but by the time you get to World War II, that is when there are all of a sudden jobs in the Kaiser shipyards. The Kaiser shipyards, both in Northern and Southern California. Northern California, they were in Sausalito and San Francisco. Southern California, especially in Long Beach. This is a picture of Marian Anderson, the great singer, christening one Liberty ship, the Booker T. Washington. But it's at this time, especially as a result of World War II, that large numbers of African Americans come, especially from Texas, but not only from Texas, from Oklahoma, from Arkansas, Louisiana, kind of from the western South. They come into California and get jobs at the shipyards, and especially in Richmond, which was kind of becomes one of the major places in which the Kaiser Liberty ships were being done. I mean, there was a time when the Kaiser shipyards throughout California were turning out, a Liberty ship every couple of days. It was incredible. 747 ships were constructed during World War II at the facility in Richmond, and you can see that the workforce was a very, very multicultural workforce. It was tough. I mean, the housing that the company put up for them was pretty ramshackle, but there were a lot of African American workers. That's a shift change in 1943, and you can see men and women were working in the shipyards. There it is again in 1943, and this kind of migration, this internal migration from the South to the shipyards of California, is largely responsible for the growth of the African American community. It always did exist, but the growth of the African American community in California. That's why Oakland, for example, becomes a tremendous place, and San Francisco becomes an important place because of the Hunters Point shipyards, and Los Angeles becomes an important place because as an outgrowth of Long Beach. The military was, as you probably know, segregated during World War II, and the African American sailors on the Navy were often given dangerous jobs, and one of their jobs was unloading munitions at Port Chicago, which is north of Oakland on Sassoon Bay. This is a very, very dangerous job because all of these things are all live ammunition. And what happened in 1944, there was a huge explosion and 200 people, the overwhelming number of them African Americans, were killed in this explosion. The Navy cleaned it up and said, okay, guys, back to work. And 50 of them, as you can see how devastating that explosion was, 50 of them refused. And they were court-martialed, and they were sentenced to 8 years at hard labor. Right? And you can see they're all people who've been court-martialed are African Americans, and the court-martialers are white officers. Well, actually, after the end of the war, their sentences were commuted, but they never received any kind of damages or reparations or anything like that for their injuries. This is Port Chicago now. There is a national memorial there. Finally, just kind of show that in the 60s, probably one of the major groups was the Black Panther Party, centered in Oakland, but the ideology of the Black Panther Party was something that affected the African American community, especially the African American youth, in many kinds of ways. So California looked a little different when you look at the ethnic history of California than the beginning of LA's story would have you believe. It was from the beginning a very, very multicultural, diverse place in which the groups that were at any particular time on the bottom found it very, very difficult. But they did persist and they did persevere. And the reason that California is the place that it is right now is by and large because of the people that you're looking at in this slide. So I hope I've given you kind of an overarching introduction to the wonderful series that you're going to be listening to the next 4 weeks. I'm going to actually be tuning in myself to listen and learn from these great speakers that Susie and Monica have been able to put together. So thank you very much. And I know that Susie has been collecting any kinds of questions. So if there are questions, there you are, Susie. I would be happy to try to get them. I'm going to stop sharing here so I can be a little bit bigger. There we are. So thank you all very much. Susie?
All right, we have one question so far. So if anybody else in the audience has any questions for Bob, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Just click on there and submit them, and I will read them off to Bob. So our first comment, our first question says, could you talk more about how Native people were treated by early Spanish and white settlers? My impression was that their language, culture, and families were decimated and brutalized by these people.
Yeah, the population decline, to put it in very abstract and impersonal terms, was tremendous. The missions were very difficult places. You know what the missionary were trying to do, what their ideology was, and this is why the fact that that pre-U.S. California was Latin American rather than British North American is important. What they were trying to do, they regarded themselves as the heirs of Bartolome de las Casas and people who were trying to protect the indigenous people from oppression by mine owners, the people who ran the silver mines, hacienda owners and things like that. But in doing so, they gathered the mission. They tried to gather the Indians together. And when the Indians were together, and we don't really know why any particular person came in, but what we do know is that when the Spanish come in, they bring not only themselves, but they bring their herds, horses and sheep and goats and everything like that. And what these animals do is they trample on the fruits and the berries and the nuts and the game. They chase away the game that people had subsisted on for centuries. And so when people come into the missions for whatever reason, the California indigenous people, like indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, did not have immunities to diseases, and they were very unhealthy places. So, in addition, you get as the 1700s turn into the 1800s, you get Canadian American fur trappers come in and they bring their own diseases as well. So, in every mission over time, the death rate far exceeds the birth rate, and there's a tremendous population decline. Best estimates would be that from about 310,000 1769, when San Diego was founded, until 1846, you have about 150,000 left. So it's about a 50% decline. When the Americans come in, they bring manifest destiny and they bring British system in. And the British system of colonialism was pretty clear regarding the indigenous people: push them out or kill them, or both. And so, in the first decade of the American era, you have bounties placed on the Indians, and especially, the Indians who were most affected by this were the native peoples who had not been in the Spanish orbit, because the gold rush was in Northern California, and the Spanish had only gone as far as Sonoma. And so a lot of people, they were still doing okay, they were hanging in. But what the Americans want to get them out of the way of us, panning and mining for gold. And so you get a tremendous, you get a bounty. The first governor of California, Peter Burnett, called for what he called a war of extermination, in his first State of the State message. So it was pretty horrible too. And by the time you get to about 1900, there are maybe about 30,000 indigenous people in California. So, the percentage-wise, it's even worse than the Spanish and Mexican eras. So in both cases, all throughout the Americas, European colonialism decimated the native populations. In California, it was two types of colonialism: first Latin American colonialism, and then British American colonialism.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. We have a comment, said wonderful photos, so thank you for that. And then a follow-up question to the one that you just responded to is can you talk a little bit more about how U.S. California policies towards the indigenous peoples and how it differed or didn't with the Spanish or Mexican California policies?
Yeah, the basic difference, is that in British North America, dating from 1637, when the Puritans massacred 400 Pequots at Mystic River in Connecticut, and the governor of Plymouth Colony, William Bradford, said in Plymouth Plantation, his famous book, that and they burned them, they burned the bodies, and Bradford said, that the smoke from that burning bodies was like incense, a sweet sacrifice to God. So the British policy, which unfortunately the U.S. took over, is basically pushing farther and farther west. The Spanish policy was that there is a place for indigenous people, and the object of the missions was to basically assimilate the indigenous people into Spanish society, and you did that by converting them into Catholicism and teaching them how to live in pueblos and compact communities, and teaching them European-style agriculture. Now, the result was, as I said a little bit earlier, devastating to the California indigenous peoples. But behind it, in Latin America, the indigenous person had a place. It was an inferior place, to be sure, and the place was often honored in the breach rather than in the observance. But there was a place. Most of the settlers who came up here, as I said, they weren't Spaniards. Even though a lot of them claimed to have ancestors back in Spain. Most of them were mestizos, who were mixed blood people, because on the northern frontier of Mexico, soldiers and Indian women would mate, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes by rape. But most people who come up have mixed blood in them. So there is in Mexico, they call themselves sometimes the cosmic race, because, it has indigenous blood in Mexico. In British America, even the Indians who tried to assimilate, the outstanding example being the Cherokee, were pushed away. So both of them were devastating, but they were devastating in different kinds of ways.
Thank you. Another question, can you say more about the American takeover of California and how it played out for what was part of Latin America? Yeah,
that's a really good question. The American takeover of California was, we call it the Mexican War. In Mexico, they still call it, with more accuracy than we do, the War of North American Aggression. It basically was, a war that the President Polk basically sparked because he was a believer in manifest destiny. He thought that the providential destiny of the United States was to rule the continent from sea to shining sea. And so, after they got Texas, there was kind of a boundary dispute between Texas and Mexico when Texas was admitted into the United States. The Mexicans said that the boundary between Texas and Coahuila, which was the Mexican province right south of Texas, was the Nueces River, which comes out at Brownville, and the Corpus Christi, and the Texans said it was the Rio Grande. So it's about 150 miles there. And so President Polk in 1846 basically sent General Taylor, Zachary Taylor, to occupy that disputed territory. He hoped that the Mexicans would fire on them, and so they did. And so he declared war. Congress enthusiastically declared war, and we took over California, New Mexico, Arizona, that disputed part of Texas, Nevada, parts of Utah. Basically, the top half of Mexico was taken. So it was a war of aggression. Ulysses Grant, who fought in the Mexican War, in his memoirs, he wrote memoirs after his presidency. He said that there was probably no more of a wicked war than was ever than that waged by the U.S. against Mexico. And most historians agree with him on that.
Okay, perfect. We are almost at time, but we do have a few more questions. So I don't know if you want to take a few more or.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. Let's, I just had one come in that changes the subject a little bit on, other than the reporting of persons of Philippine descent joining with the persons of Latin American and the United Farm Workers Movement, what other times did ethnic minorities support and join each other in causes?
You know, that's really an excellent question. In the citrus in the agricultural industry, you know, I showed you those pictures of the citrus industry in the late 19th century. There were some attempts at unionization. A number of those people in the picture, I mean, it came from South Asia, you know, from India, what's now Pakistan. Some of them came from even farther part, you know, Malaysia and places like that. The Philippines become, the U.S. conquers the Philippines in the Spanish-American War in 1898. And Philippines, you know, since it is a U.S. territory, they are allowed to come in. And there's a steady stream of Filipinos who do come in all throughout the teens, 20s, and 30s, and they mainly often work in agriculture. During the 1930s, there were some attempts to organize the agricultural workers, and Filipino and South Asians were very much a part of that. But the trouble was the only people who were willing to try to organize them at that point were the communists. And in area after area, the local constabulary just mercilessly broke up those unions, and the effort failed. But most of those early agricultural efforts were multicultural. I only talked about the one in the 60s. You know, but there were a whole bunch of others as well. And indeed, in the canneries where the women worked, you know, the overwhelming majority of women were Mexican women, but there were also a number of Filipina women and a number of Asian women as well. Rosemary, my wife's grandmother, worked in a cannery in San Jose in the 1940s, and she reported, you know, she worked with a whole bunch of women. She was actually not even Mexican; she was Cuban. So there's Cubans there as well. You know, so there's a whole bunch of different ethnic groups gathered into certain high labor industries. And agriculture in California, you know, from the days of the mission and the ranchos to now is the industry in agricultural, which really is the industry in California that really fits that bill.
Okay, wonderful. We have a few more questions, but I do want to be sensitive to time. So I have one that kind of combines a few of them, and maybe we end on that. There are a few comments in here just about relationship with Chumash. So I do want to, before we get to the last one, just put a plug in that next Thursday we will have James Yee with the Barbareño Chumash Band of Indians. So we'll definitely dive more into detail of the relationship with the Barbareño Chumash and the mission and our history next Thursday. So we hope that you can join for that. But so I don't want to dive too much into that right now, but there are a few that just kind of talk a little bit about the history of, you know, kind of blatant racism that's kind of glossed over in our education system, and just the racial tensions that are in our country right now. And so, you know, I don't know if you want to say anything to kind of end us tonight on, you know, what's happening and really how our history has played into what's currently at play right now in our society.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very clear. I said, you know, both with the Chinese in the 1870s and then the Mexicans in the Great Depression, that California really, you know, especially during times of economic downturn, tends to blame, or had tended to blame, immigrants, you know, for taking away our jobs, you know, but that kind of tension, you know, is only the tip of the iceberg. There's other kinds of tensions, you know. So, you know, it wasn't that the Japanese were taking away anybody's jobs in San Francisco when the Board of Supervisors segregated them in the school system in San Francisco. There is, I think, a lot of it in California, as maybe opposed to other areas of the country. You know, depends on where white settlers come from. And in Southern California, when the railroad gets there in the 1880s, a good number of people who come to California tend to be from the Midwest areas, which were at that time overwhelmingly white, and so kind of seeing all of these people all of a sudden. It wasn't a gradual kind of thing for them. It was like all of a sudden, my neighbors, are not only like, they don't only look like me. They're all of these other strange people. And I think that the fact that immigration from California was coming from, especially as the 19th century turned into the 20th century, was coming from, the Midwestern part of the country. Is part of that, because the Midwestern part of the country was not, at that time, not an especially multicultural thing. So it was really a jolt for these people. And again, people are coming from, it's like Kansas or Nebraska or someplace like that, and they're struggling to make it themselves. It's not easy for them. And when they see, whenever somebody sees somebody who looks different from them doing better than them, especially if you are white, you tend to resent that. And I think that resentment maybe was more intense in parts of California than in other parts of the country, because it was a shock and a jolt to people.
Yeah. All right. Well, first, I would love to thank you, Bob, for being here tonight and putting all this wonderful overview together for us as we kick off our History of Race in California series. So thank you very much, Bob. We really appreciate it.
Well,
and thank you. Yes, and thank you all for attending this evening. We hope that you join us for the next 4 series after this, and we'll see you next Thursday. And just a reminder that we will be sending out the resource document following the session. So we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.